Today I'm going to do a Dana 44 re-gear with an ARB air locker. Get a good work area established to where you can see things, keep it clean as you can. Makes a big difference when you're putting things together. First order of business, we've got to throw that ring gear in the oven to get it heated up so it'll fit over the locker so we can get that put on, and then we're going to put the pinion bearing on the pinion gear. Take your pinion gear, put your slinger on there. You're going to take your bearing, make sure it's oriented the right way. Take an old cone that you cut off your other bearing, use that as your press, that way your bearing spins freely, doesn't get damaged. Press it on. You know when it gets seated, because it obviously stops, gets a little bit difficult. Stop at that point, don't damage your bearing. Since the outer race doesn't need to come out, we'll press that in right off the bat while we're waiting for that ring gear to heat up. Try to get it started square. That'll make your life a lot easier. You'll know when it seats, you'll hear a pretty good ding. Right there, that's set. One thing I forgot to mention, if you don't have a clamshell puller, and I don't, what I do is I use setup bearings. So these are brand new bearings. I just honed them out on the outside to fit in for my inner pinion bearing. I mark them so that way I know which ones I need to use. I use a setup nut, that way I'm not trashing the threads on the pinion gear with a new nut pulling on and off. So a setup nut, I will take a Dremel and I'll file down the inside of those threads a little bit to get the sharp edges off, and that'll be enough to clamp it on for all the times you have to take it on and off without galling up your threads. With the ARB, I happen to have an extra seal housing that broke on a different vehicle, so I use this as a setup seal housing. Otherwise, you're going to have to use your seal housing with the copper line on it, which isn't a big deal. Just make sure you don't damage that copper line. For me, it's simple to use this. It's out of the way till I'm ready for final install. Okay, when you go to start doing everything here, make sure your axle housing inside is absolutely clean. Get in there, get every little speck of crap out of there you can. If you're going to install an ARB, you're going to need to grind off these little slots right here for an oil return. So gear oil that gets out in the axle tubes, it has a place to drain back in and get back into the cycle. If you haven't done that yet, I would wait until the very end to do that for final assembly, because when you go to put your carrier or your locker back in here, the shims will jump down in here and it's a pain in the butt to get it. And when you get it once, believe me, it's a good day. So wait to do those to the very end, and then you only have to deal with those slots once you're putting your locker for final assembly. So while we're waiting for the ring gear to heat up still, I'm gonna take my setup race. I'm not gonna put anything behind it as of right now because I put on a pretty thick pinion shim. In fact, my outer pinion shim is so thick it may already have my pinion gear too deep. If that's the case, I'm gonna have to change out the bearing, but I'm gonna get this race in here for now and get this pinion installed and snug so I can get that carrier in here. This race is giving me a hell of a time. So a good setup race will slide in and out fairly easy well, let me rephrase it, not easy. It'll slide in and out, but you should have a pretty good fit like what I have there, to where it doesn't fall out. So just to get it squared back up, there it goes. It's easy in there now. Now, one of the things that people talk about is your checking distance on the front of your pinion head, and oh my God, how am I going to adjust shims? Blah blah blah. You know what? You don't need that stuff when you're doing this not for a living. If you're a hobbyist, start with something and then move your way there. So what I usually do is I start with the shims that were already in there. I don't measure out what they are because it doesn't really matter. Start with what you have, get it in there, get your carrier in there or your locker in there, check your backlash, make sure it's in spec, and run a pattern. When you run that pattern, it's going to tell you whether your pinion's too deep or too shallow, and then you just take it from there. So as you're putting this in, you have to put your outer pinion bearing on, and that's an interference fit, so it gets pushed on by the yoke. And I'm going to do that with an impact driver. You got to be real careful though, because if you're not putting shims in the back as of yet, which I'm not, you don't want to over tighten and crush your bearings. Check, see where you're at. Just want enough resistance that's similar to the preload of what you're going to get. And if you see here, I bet you have about 15 inch-pounds of preload there, and that's all I need. For those of you that are saying BS, let's just take a look out of curiosity. I'm sorry, I'm at 18. Which is still fine. So with that being in place, my next step is going to get the ring gear on the carrier, get the original shims on here, put it in, get an idea of where I'm at. Once your ring gear comes out of the oven, it only takes about 20, maybe 30 minutes at 200 degrees is all. Prep your ring gear bolts, putting your red Loctite on there. I'm sure you all have seen pictures of ring gear bolts that have backed out and caused all sorts of damage. Get those ready to go. Don't forget to put your gloves back on because that ring gear is hot. Line up your holes. Once you get it there, take two ring gear bolts, get them started opposite of each other. Pull your ring gear back up, make sure it stays tight. And I just put those two in nice and gentle until I can make sure I get these others in and everything else is able to fit just right. I use a cordless drill with the clutch. That way I'm not worried about breaking anything. I'll still torque in a star type pattern. So there's no real torque there. That's just getting them set. So now I'm going to go through and make sure the ring gear is set completely flat. And then I'll take this over to the vise. I'll put it in the vise. I'll torque all these down and then we're good to go from there. One of the things I do with my ring gear bolts is I mark the numbers to make sure I'm getting a good torque sequence on them. And I'll start off at about 50, and then I'll go to final torque spec of 80 on these. Got to be careful when you're in the vise here. If this falls out, obviously you're going to damage ring gear and lock and stuff, so be careful. Take it up to 80. Another thing you want to make sure too, before you put your ring gear on, make sure that backside's completely smooth. There's no burrs or anything that may keep the ring gear from sitting on there properly. So if you didn't do that, make sure you do that. All right, good there. Okay, in case you don't know, bearing cap bolts are specific to the axle and specific to the side, as well as specific to orientation. Right here, there's a letter stamped into the side of this case. And this one here, it's stamped D. And if you look up close to this ring gear, or I'm sorry, the bearing cap here, you're gonna see the D mark there. It's in a sideways orientation. The letter here is in a sideways orientation, so that would say this bearing cap goes this way. If for some reason you know it goes to this side, but you're not sure which orientation it is, look at the inside of the bearing cap. You're gonna see some machining marks there. Line them up with the machining marks on this side and you'll have the correct orientation. This one here, there's a letter D, but you can only see less than half of it, but I can see the corner, so I know it's a D that's upright. I'll look at this bearing cap here, and you see the D right there, and how it's in an upright orientation, so I know this one goes that way. So with the original shim stack, I'm gonna put this carrier up there and see where we're at. The one thing that I will say is that working off of a lift versus a bench, and I prefer a bench any day of the week, but my Jeep's already up on a lift, so I'm just gonna do it here. And to be honest with you, it is, I can work through this without a problem, but it's easier to work on a bench because this carrier or locker has to come in and out several times. And the thing you have to be careful of is you have gravity working against you here, where when you go to pull that locker out, or if you're fumbling around, the locker could fall to the ground, and damages stuff. So be real careful with that. On a workbench, I would have it tilted the other way where gravity would work in my favor, and the locker wants to fall into the housing. So keep that in mind. This gets heavy over time when you're trying to force this thing in there without a case spreader. So let's see what we get here. Okay, I can tell you I'm missing some shim somewhere because that went in way too easy. Nope, I'm gonna take that out because I see it happened. So be careful, take it out. One of the other tools I use to help put the shims in is a little wood block. That way it doesn't bend the shims. Tap on it just enough if they start getting out of place. I prefer to do this without gloves, but that green gear is still hot, so. Oh, there we go. All right. Nope, I got the right shims for sure. Okay, you see how these are barely sitting out, so I'll make sure that I get those in. This is where you gotta be careful. If you don't have enough preload here, this thing's gonna fall out. So listen for that backlash. That backlash sounds pretty good actually. So before I do anything else, I like to hear that these are set. So I'll take my BFH tap. You hear how you get that ping? That tells me that's seated all the way. Take my bearing cap bolts in there, and you don't want to check backlash without these in at least finger tight. I don't feel like sitting here all day and screwing those in by hand, so I take my drill with the clutch, make sure that's set up against that. You hear the clicking? That's your backlash. So on a low pinion housing, your backlash is going to go, basically you want to take your backlash reading from the drive side of the gear, since that's a flat spot. So you're going to throw your, I just did a high pinion 30, so I'm going to readjust all this, but you're going to throw your dial indicator on here, get everything readjusted here. Get on tooth, make sure it's not touching any other part of the tooth so it's not influenced. And you take a reading. Zero it out. Right now I'm at exactly 5. That's within spec. The spec for backlash on this is 5 to 8. Now that's the low side of the spec, but I'm okay with it to take a reading or take a pattern to figure out where I'm at with this pinion depth. So, get some paint real quick. You'll need to paint a couple teeth, a couple 3. Make sure you get good coating all the way across because you need to see if it's leaning off to one side or the other. So there's 3 teeth there. I'll come back on the drive side. I'll coat 3 teeth there. Make sure everything's coated nice and good. Make sure you have good coverage, not missing anything. Put that there. I'll take my drill on a low setting. That's where a lot of people don't get a great pattern. Hold up against that with the glove, rotate the pinion with my drill, and get my reading. Get that readjusted there. Turn around, go the other way. let your battery die, go get a new battery. Doing it this way allows me to get a lot of rotations in under some decent force. So you see the pattern here. Okay, so let's take a look at that pattern now. This is the drive side. Wow, right off the bat, I tell you what, I'm all but there. Take a look at the coast side. That looks pretty damn good too. All right, so here's kind of my dilemma right now. I put that thick oil slinger on the front side of that pinion, but I still need to add an oil baffle behind the race. So that is going to drive it just a little bit deeper. And looking at that, I may be able to go just a tad. So I'm gonna throw it in there just to see what it looks like. And if the pattern's still acceptable, then I'll run it that way. If not, then I'm gonna have to figure some things out. All right, so I pull my pull my bearing cap bolts off. And trying to pull the carrier out, sometimes you shouldn't be able to just pull it straight out. So that thing's in there. So a lot of people talk about putting a crowbar here, something in here to pry this out. Not necessary at all. Take a ring gear or a wrench same size as your ring gear bolt. Rotate your, oh, I forgot I've been doing a high pinion, it's on the top side. Rotate to there and slowly turn your pinion and it's gonna push it right out. Okay, so be careful because right now gravity's working against me. And then you take that off, set it there. Make sure you don't drop anything, and most importantly, don't drop your shims everywhere, get them all mixed up and all that stuff. One other note. You guys notice I did not press bearings onto my locker. I'm reusing my existing bearings, so that's one step that I didn't include in this. Whatever bearings your locker or carrier calls for, press those on. If you're using an ARB, they go on, shims go to the outside, so you can press those on right away. Okay, I got the oil slinger behind the race. Now we're gonna put the locker back in. Check backlash, run another pattern. You son of a bitch. Don't you dare fall out. So with that being done, actually that's kind of interesting. I have zero backlash there. So with that being moved in that deep, what I need to do then is pull this out. I'm gonna move a shim from this side to this side, loosen up just a bit. I don't even need to get these on there to take a reading because I have zero to begin with. I'm not sure what I just said there, but I need to take a shim from this side and move it over to this side so that way it opens up and goes that way. So if I said the opposite, I knew what I meant. All right, I have a thick shim in there, so I'm gonna have to go do some shim checks, get a good balance, and then I'll be back. Okay, so I went over to the table, worked out my shim stacks, make sure I get everything where I need it. Put it back in here. My backlash now is set at 9. That is out of spec. Spec is 5 to 8. So what I need to do now is take a shim from this side, move it over to this side, tighten up just a little bit. So I know I have a 3/1000 of an inch shim over here. I'm gonna move it to this side and see how much that changes. And if it's too much, then I'm gonna have to do more math to get, to move a 1/1000 of an inch shim. So this is the whole frustration behind doing re-gears. I really enjoyed it. It's a fun puzzle, but don't settle for less than perfect. You're looking at shims. 1/1000 of an inch can make all the difference in the world. So I'm going to take it apart and get after it again. Okay, I got shims changed around. Something was bothering me on the preload side of things. It just didn't feel like there was enough preload going in there. I could, take 5 or 6 whacks to get in there with the dead blow hammer, but it still just didn't feel right. So part of my solving this problem was instead of just adding 3 to this side, I added, I think it was 6, or maybe just a little bit more than that, but I had 6. That firmed this up. I mean, it was a pain in the ass to get it in here, but that's exactly what I want. I want that good preload on there. So let's see where we're at now. Sounds like we're within the ballpark anyway. So now we're at 7. That is very, very nice. I'm glad we have that. Now let's run another pattern and see what we get. For some reason you're having a hard time getting a reading on your teeth, you can thin out your gear marking compound with gear oil, and that'll help to give you a better pattern. Whoops. On the high setting of my drill, I'm going to redo this one. Take a look. All right. Yeah, so, okay. Pull this out of here. So that's doing to us now. See how much that changed pattern now? We're definitely too deep. So not what I'm looking for. So I have 2 options. I can eliminate that oil baffle, or I could pull the oil baffle. I'm sorry, I could either eliminate the oil baffle and run that first pattern I had, which is awesome, or I could pull the pinion, the front pinion bearing, and put thinner shims back there, or get a thinner slinger. So I'm gonna take a look around and see what I have. When removing your pinion gear, This outer pinion bearing is pressed onto it when you put the pinion nut on, so it just doesn't slide out. I'll show you how to get that out. So take your pinion nut and screw it back on just a couple, 3 threads. And then you're going to take your punch. There's a little hole at the end of the pinion, and you're going to slowly tap. Until it comes loose. And again, you're tapping, you're not beating the hell out of it, but you leave your pinion nut on so that way your pinion bearing just doesn't fall out onto the ground. Simple as that. Okay, with a little bit of ingenuity, I just took a couple pieces of angle iron, put the old bearing cone on there, outlined it, cut it down, made myself a little bearing puller with for use with my shop press. So it came off nice and easy. Got the oil slinger that's supposed to be in there. I thought for some reason I grabbed the wrong one, but I didn't, or the right one, but I didn't. But now we should be good to go. So I'm gonna throw the carrier back in here, and we are going to see where we're at now. Okay, I put in the thinner oil baffle sling and put the carrier back in. Now my backlash is at almost 13, 12 and a half. So that's good. That shows me that I'm going to need to probably put shims behind the race now that I went to a thinner slinger. But before I do that, I have to get in backlash spec, then run the pattern, then see where I'm at. So I'll do that next. Okay, everything's back together. Now my backlash is at 7. So that is exactly what I want. So my guess is this pattern should run shallow. Probably not by much, but we're gonna find out. So let me paint these back up. Let's take a look. As expected, running just a touch shallow. See what the drive side looks like. There we go, good. So now with that like that, I can pull the pinion bearing out, get some shims behind the race now, get that dialed in perfectly. So I'm gonna work on that for a bit and I'll be right back. I made a 0.02 of an inch shift to loosen up my backlash a little bit. Let's see where we're at. We're right at 0.08 now, so that's on the outside edge of that spec, but that is good enough to run a pattern. Ah, come on. losing another finger. All right, we are getting somewhere now. We are just a tad bit shallow. So now we are right where we need to be. It looks like a great pattern, great diffuse. Drive side doesn't look bad. Actually, that looks good. Take a look at that again. Focus. Yeah, that looks really good. I don't think I need to change a damn thing. I'm gonna play this a little bit just to double check, make sure that pattern's where I want it. Then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now that I have it out of the housing and in some light where I can see, I still think that that is just a touch shallow. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark what I have right now as far as shims, because I do really like that pattern. I'm gonna mark what I have as far as shims in there. I'm gonna see if I can make a 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch pinion depth change, see what that looks like. If I don't like it, then I'll come back to this. So at least we are dialed in. All right, so I worked with it for a couple times, got it dialed in exactly where I want it, got a good looking pattern. The next thing we need to do now is pull all this stuff back out, because we have to drive in the new inner bearing race. So we have to get that driven in, and then we have to get the seal on the back side and all that. So there's still plenty of work left to do. At this point also, before I forget, once I'm good with the pattern, everything's in there, I would take my axle shafts, put them inside, run air to the locker, make sure that in fact that everything on the inside is working good, that my seal housing is covering that hole correctly, so it's getting the right amount of air and everything in there with no leaks. So that's something you may want to do. All right, final pattern has been obtained. As I stated earlier, I'm going to now put in the new race, replace that setup race. And if you're going to use setup bearings, there's no problems with that. But I suggest that you use new bearings for setup. Just buy a new set and use those and keep them as your setup. And the reason is just a little bit of tolerances that I don't like on used bearings compared to when you get a final pattern. You install the new race or whatever and it changes. So try to keep everything as consistent as possible. I'm glad you're paying attention. We have to get our pinion preload set before we do all that other stuff. So I'm gonna throw 72 thou of shims on here, see where that puts me, and then we'll go from there. So 72 is a little bit light, barely had any preload, so I changed it up to a 66. No, that's stuck up with this here. Sitting right at 15. Normally I do gears, I go 16 to 20, but Revolution in their instructions, they say they want 10 to 15. So I'm at the upper end of that, and I'm fine with that. So I'm all set there. Time for final assembly. Time to get the bearing, the baffle, and the seal in. What I do is I take some gear oil, I put it all over the race in there, then I put my bearing in there, spin it around to make sure I get some gear oil on that bearing, because it'll be just a little bit before it gets gear oil up here from the first time we run it. So I do that. Then I take a little bit more and just spill it right into the bearing. From there, put in my baffle. And then we have to tap in our seal. And before you tap in the seal, make sure that you've cleaned up your surfaces there. Getting these started, always the biggest pain in the ass. Before you put your pinion bearing in, make sure you clean off all the little shavings from putting that pinion up on over and over. Get all the stuff out of there. And then on your yoke, make sure you put a little bit of bearing grease to keep it from rubbing a groove into your yoke. All right, these need to get torqued down to about, I think it's 160 to 200 is what it calls for. I'll double. Okay, the pinion's all installed, final assembly. Now we have to get the locker in here for final assembly. Now I have to be really careful because I have the copper tube that I have to deal with as well from the ARB this time, where I didn't have to deal with it before. There's a shim on this other side that I have to have ground out too that plays a part. It makes everything just a little bit tougher. Oh, I just had it. There it is. Get that there, okay. Put that down for now. Out of the way. The one thing you have to pay attention to when you're doing your ARB is this bearing, the seal housing here needs to get up out of the way of everything here, and you got to make sure you don't beat this thing up too while you're putting it in. So it takes a little bit of patience for sure, but also make sure you're paying attention. Before I go any further, I want to get the outside master shim caught up with the copper line. In other words, where I ground that down, I want it to be able to come up and it's not going to cut into the copper line. All right, so I took a small drift punch and I made the copper line in that shim match up the way I wanted to. I ran my copper line through the bulkhead fitting. So now I'm going to put on my bulkhead fitting, or the next part of that, but there's an O-ring inside the bulkhead fitting that you need in there, and make sure it's there and it's not torn. So I'm pushing up on my copper line to make sure that I'm getting maximum pressure up top. Where did my other wrenches go? So this fitting here is, oh, it's a 3, it's not 7/16, I'm such a ding-dong. The top nut's a 7/16, so you don't want to crush this O-ring is what I'm trying to say, so you just want to make this snug, just enough to put pressure on it. And then you can see where my ARB line there squished. And it's squished because I had this apart and I needed to test my front ARB, so I had to put some vice grips on this to keep air from coming out. Cut off that tip, put this one on. Force it right over the nipple, slide that on. That's your 7/16 there. The thing is, when you're tightening this, you want to make sure that you're not tightening that 3/8. So I'll keep an eye on it until it gets snug. And then I'll back it up, but sometimes the wrench heads are too big. That one's going to be too big. That one's better, so I'm going to hold that in place while I tighten this one. There we go. That's all you need for that. I'm going to make sure that that's set where I need it now. You hear how solid that sounds? That means it's hitting home. No bearings are moving, no shims are moving. Still got my backlash, which we'll check again every step of the way, or make sure everything's going in the correct way. So my bearing cap's in the right way. These get torqued to 80. You be real careful that you're going to clear your ARB line here. When we get this bearing cap on, I'll show you what I'm talking about. That on, so I want to make sure that my copper line isn't touching anything, and I am touching over here. So I'm going to torque these real quick first, then we'll check a final backlash, and then should be able to button it up. Actually, I'll test the locker to make sure it works too. Torque's done on that. Oh, just a little bit of movement will do. So you gotta be careful. Seal housing can break real easy, but you've got to keep your copper lines off of things like the bearing caps and stuff, like right there. So I'll back that up in there, and then I'll bend this over to make sure everything clears the way I need it to without busting or stressing out that seal housing. Oh, stupid flashlights. There we go. Up over, clear there, clear of the ring gear completely, so we're good there. Let's check our backlash again, just to make sure nothing fell way out of whack. God, that would suck right now if it did. Sitting right at 6, so that's good. I'm gonna run another pattern just to take a look. Probably not pin on this one. See what she looks like. Right there. All right. Yep, that's good still. Excellent. Excellent. All right, so it's exactly what I need. That's done. All I do is throw some gear oil in there, throw my axle shafts back in there, and we're all done.